the ADL for putting on this webinar. Also wanted to say thank you to the working group leads among our sister working groups within the 9274 suite at IEEE. Over at the 9274 xAPI base standard, that's John Opolczak, Andy Johnson, and Nick Washburn. And over at the 9274.2 standard on xAPI profiles, it's Aaron Silvers and Will Hoyt. Thank you to all of them. What we're going to be talking about, to provide some background, xAPI provides interoperability in the ability to track learning and performance data. The work of this working group at the IEEE is to create a standard recommended practice to provide guidance to engineers and other technical implementers of xAPI in regard to defining best practices for the implementation of secure deployments. And we're aiming to help xAPI technical implementers to understand some key security concerns relevant and germane to xAPI technologies, to help customers of xAPI technologies to understand the impact of xAPI-related security matters on their technology environment, and to help individuals to accomplish the goals of recognizing potential security concerns in relation to an xAPI implementation, to help understand how to implement best practices in xAPI technologies in regard to security, and to help follow a common standard protocol for defining and addressing matters of cybersecurity in regard to xAPI. So the key question that we're going to ask through this webinar is, how do systems and applications in a learning ecosystem securely share xAPI data? And why is this important? So xAPI will shortly be approved as an IEEE global standard. It is part of the 9274 suite of the portfolio of standards at the Learning Technology Standards Committee. We have a few months ahead of us in balloting and reviews to formalize the standard. Well, as that standard becomes adopted as a global standard, we want to address issues of cybersecurity that were specifically left out of the baseline standard for some practical reasons, which we'll discuss. Just an Easter egg here. People always ask me where the numbers come from. The 9274, that is the xAPI group at IEEE, is on a touch-tone phone, xAPI 9274. I always thought that was fun. The cybersecurity work specifically is done in the 9274.4.2 working group. Just for matters of clearing up delineation about all of these numbers, point 1 refers to the baseline standard itself, the xAPI standard. Point 2 relates to the xAPI profiles standard itself. Point 3 relates to individual profiles that will be developed as standards. For example, we may want to develop CMI 5 as a standard, or we may want to standardize the master object model profile as a standard. That would occur in point 3. And point 4 are recommended practices. These are guidelines regarding implementation. So cybersecurity fits into point 4. The purpose of our group is to provide cybersecurity guidance to technical implementers of xAPI. So what does that mean? So the recommended practice standard provides guidance for secure implementation. It will define terms, including stakeholder types. It will document how secure xAPI implementation fits into the broader category of best practices in cybersecurity. It will discuss xAPI-specific cybersecurity best practices and provide use cases to illustrate cybersecurity practices related to these implementations. The document that we're building itself is organized into 5 sections. The first being about the scope and purpose, the second being normative references, for example, references to other IEEE standards. The third provides our own definitions around xAPI cybersecurity. The fourth is the bulk of the standard and will provide the information on common issues and common mitigations related to cybersecurity protocol with xAPI, as well as risk management and privacy and personally identifiable information. And then section 5 will describe some use cases. So this standard includes best practices in xAPI implementation, LRS communication, mitigations of common cybersecurity issues, and cybersecurity lifecycle. If you think about it, xAPI implementation itself can be from the point of view of designing data that will be issued by a learning record provider that is a data source like an LMS or a mobile app or a serious game that emits activity according to the xAPI specification. And that data then is validated by and collected in a learning record store. The learning record store itself has communication with the learning record provider and also with other learning record stores and consumers of the data from learning record stores. At each of those touch points, there are going to be best practices in regard to safe and secure transmission of the xAPI data. Those mitigations of common cybersecurity issues, what we're going to see is that xAPI fits into the broader category of the communication of data and the use of APIs. And we'll talk about that in a moment. And then in regard to this life cycle idea, the baseline xAPI specification and what originally began in ADL, there were conversations that occurred back then as to whether or not to include cybersecurity and secure communications information within the specification and within the standard themselves. In the last formal version of the specification, which was 1.0.3, I believe in that version, a decision was made to point to outside resources for more information about cybersecurity. Those resources were originally collected by a group within the ADL design cohorts for xAPI called xAPI Sec. xAPI Sec defined several of the common web communications protocols that were best practices in relation to cybersecurity that xAPI implementers would need to know about. As the process moved into formal standards, the decision was made not to include that information within the baseline standard itself, but rather to create a formal working group to draw up a recommended practice guideline for cybersecurity. In this way, the baseline spec or standard can still be used for a variety of purposes that may touch on varying needs and importance for cybersecurity practices without hamstringing developers and implementers on doing specific things specific ways every single time. So for example, there may be a difference in the way someone sets up an LRS for an informal purpose in showing off a proof of concept or doing an experiment versus the implementation of a formal cybersecurity practice that's integrated with DevSecOps for the purpose of establishing xAPI and learning record stores within a federated enterprise environment. And we shouldn't expect someone doing experiments to have to conform to standards of someone doing enterprise implementations. That wouldn't make sense. So it makes more sense to draw that out, put it in its own recommended practice, and let people choose from among those recommendations what makes the most sense for their implementation. So there are some common misconceptions about xAPI cybersecurity that I think are useful to talk about at the beginning of our discussion here. First of all is this idea that xAPI is somehow different. So I hear this sometimes within the acquisition world. I hear this concern sometimes from enterprise implementers who are new to the standard. Is xAPI going to increase the overhead of what I need to invest in terms of cybersecurity? And I would say that by and large, and the work at the IEEE will, I think, bear this out, by and large, it's shown that xAPI can be treated the same as common API-based communication technologies that are regularly implemented in systems small and large, from big commercial vendors to things that the government has established themselves. xAPI does have some special properties, and there are pieces to an xAPI implementation that should be called out, but the overall gist of cybersecurity and the overall gist of what is recommended in this draft standard is that if you are following common industry best practices in regard to cybersecurity, in regard to the communication of data, and in regard to how you store that data, you're not going to see much, if any, difference between the common concerns that exist for other sorts of data than exist for xAPI data. Part of the early confusion, we believe, has to do with, in many cases, the concept of cybersecurity and the concept of content policy were often conflated, and people thought they sort of meant the same thing. So in the same way that anyone could post sensitive information like social security number as a tweet onto Twitter, that would fall more under content policy for a takedown of that information than it would on a cybersecurity side, where, for example, on the cybersecurity side, Twitter could be defending itself against a denial of service attack. So within xAPI, because it deals with human readable text and machine readable information, there can be a lot of content expressed within an xAPI statement. However, this standard would argue that content moderation policies can run in parallel to, but are separate from cybersecurity policies, and that the cybersecurity aspects should not necessarily try to conflate with those content policies. And the third common misconception is general that we hear across cybersecurity. The idea that cybersecurity is static. I harden something, it's done, and then I'm good to go. With any system, there should be continuous monitoring, continuous integration, continuous understanding of the security posture of the applications, the systems, and the systems that they reside on. So the document speaks to this idea that there is dynamism, and part of the reason why we made a decision at the IEEE to do this as what's called a recommended practice standard, as opposed to a technical standard, is that it provides us the ability to use different language. So for example, in a technical standard like the 0.1 base standard for xAPI, it uses the word shall to indicate that there are mandatory requirements that need to be strictly followed in order to conform to the standard, and from which no deviation is permitted. Down a level from that would be a normative word like should, which indicates that among several possibilities, one is recommended as particularly suitable without mentioning or excluding the others. Or it could be that a certain course of action is preferred, but not necessarily required. And in the case of cybersecurity, to maintain a vigilant awareness that there are dynamic activities occurring and there's change over time related to offensive and defensive technologies, strategies, and processes. We take that quote should mentality here, and we say you should choose from these possibilities, so that you're not ham-fisted and tied down to saying that something absolutely has to be a certain way, and then something happens in the near future that causes problems for you. So we'll look through a couple of the sort of common issues related to xAPI cybersecurity. And I want to talk about this sort of from a business user or acquisitions level. And then if people do have specific technical questions that they'd like to go into detail with, I would actually invite you following this webinar to join the working group. It's free and open to the public, to join the working group and bring those technical concerns directly to the working group. The way the working group does its business is through consensus. So we invite people to bring issues, concerns, etc., of a technical layer to the working group to discuss there, and that's sort of the proper format to do that. So with that said, from the giving some of the common issues that occur, first has to do with because the xAPI data model itself is open source and in the IEEE will be standardized and transparent, it is comparatively easy to assess the risk posed by the inclusion of attributes communicated via xAPI. The data model itself poses no specific risk as compared to any other data model supporting any RESTful web service. The cybersecurity considerations regarding xAPI, therefore, should prioritize considering the risks inherent in how xAPI is implemented and how xAPI data is communicated, as opposed to, we would argue, as opposed to overanalyzing the risk of the xAPI data model itself. So there are several known issues which may have a bearing on those implementation decisions with regard to cybersecurity. They differ in severity of risk depending on implementation. So, for example, in one implementation, there may be a risk factor that that in the context of that implementation is of high severity, whereas the same risk factor for another implementation may not be of high severity. It may be of medium or lower severity. Again, it depends on the context of the implementation. With regard to xAPI from the point of view of it as an API, the LRS implements API authentication or authorization. So what happens if that authentication or authorization is non-standard, outdated, or otherwise known to be vulnerable to attack? We would say that the implementation of xAPI itself should follow as a baseline industry best practices for the secure communication of an API. And when we're talking about that, specifically with regard to LRPs, that's learning record providers, data sources producing xAPI data, to learning record store communication, something to think about is that the LRS credentials or access that a learning record provider uses should be scoped to only what it needs. For example, providing credentials that only allow post statements but not get functions or statements. So likewise, any data consumers that pull information from an LRS should be scoped so that, for example, they get read-only access. Depending on the implementation, you may make different decisions. But that scoping issue really helps to mitigate against a lot of the core issues related to implementation and communication. So a couple of things. I'll give you an issue. For example, the LRP exposes unencrypted LRS credentials to users of a web browser. These could appear, maybe they're hard-coded into the JavaScript of a web page. What the recommended practice would say is that for secure xAPI usage in regard to the requirement of LRPs as data providers, the implementation should include the alignment of the information architecture of the LRP against best practices for information architecture, data management processes that are internal to the LRP, secure network hierarchy, for example, in SaaS and cloud environments, and a data persistence mechanism reliability. So all of the types of things that might occur within an LRP implementation itself should be addressed really on the LRP side. There's nothing that an LRS can do about that. So in implementing xAPI, we want to ensure that the LRP, whether we're building it ourselves or whether we're using a third party for something like content authoring, we want to ensure that from an InfoSec perspective, the LRP itself is following best practices, that there are clear and attributable data management processes internal to that LRP. In the case of cloud resources or hosted resources, that we understand that the LRP exists within a secure network hierarchy, and that there is a data persistence mechanism. This sort of starts to relate now to the transport level security. So when deploying a production xAPI implementation, secure data transmission from the learning record provider to the learning record store should require transport layer security, meaning established cryptographic protocols which allow the implementer with a means of attaining communications security over the network. This involves both encryption in transit. So as I emit data from a data source, it is in transit, it should be encrypted, and then encryption at rest. It lands, it's validated by and is stored in the LRS, and it should be encrypted at rest. To mitigate against some of the common issues, for example, PII and privacy issues at the transport level, the implementation of xAPI should obscure the user details in transit and use a token rather than personally identifiable information. We don't want implementers, especially in enterprise scenarios, to be pushing around either unencrypted or otherwise personally identifiable information. So that should be handled. A payload can be encrypted to any desired standard during the transport and then decrypted at the LRS ingest. And we would refer, within the standards document, we would refer you out to RSA for more information specifically about that. Note, and this is important for vendors of xAPI technologies to consider, is that such implementations as we're discussing here require custom development outside of the scope of the base standard for xAPI. So in other words, an LRS may claim conformance with the xAPI standard without including such decryption capabilities. So this is an example of why the cybersecurity of xAPI products is really a matter of implementation and not merely conformance to the base standard. That'll get you partway, and we'll talk about that later in regard to data validation, but implementation is really the issue here. So just to recap there, because this is one that folks need to recognize, is that any learning record store is able to claim conformance with the IEEE 9274.1 standard without including the decryption capabilities that we just discussed. So there's a difference between standards conformance and best practices in cybersecurity, which is why our working group is working on this document. With regard to the network security, either keep the LRS internal to the local private network of the LRP, or create a posture where you have a security tunnel between the two. Note that the higher the security level, the lesser the tolerance for risk, the more back of the house the transport needs to be. in terms of common issues with like hacks and attacks and things like that, again, it's important to recognize that there is nothing special about xAPI here. Denial of service attacks and malicious payload or man-in-the-middle attacks can happen to any web service. And therefore, it's important, really, to mitigate by following generally approved industry best practices for those types of attacks. It's not something specific to xAPI, but failure to address those things in an xAPI implementation can contribute to the increase of risk for that implementation. There are a couple interesting things here. With regard to zero trust, the DoD security posture has moved towards zero trust. Currently, there was news that they're testing zero trust or beginning tests of zero trust against the big cloud providers. This potentially can cause complications. So it's something that you need to think about through the way that you're implementing your xAPI ecosystem or your xAPI software technologies within a broader ecosystem. So, for example, in the case where we have an implementation that follows the general practices of the total learning architecture, and we have a federation of LRSs. In other words, along the edge of our system, for example, close to where data is being produced, we have multiple LRSs, each responsible for validating the data conformance of the data produced by those systems right close to the systems themselves. Well, in a locked down network, how do we have assurance of which federates are allowed to connect to the system? And in a zero trust environment, what level of sort of reduplications of effort are there going to be, or what type of continuing integration must exist in order to ensure that the federates themselves are allowed to connect. And it can complicate things further when we have, say, a new project comes online. Say we have a new learning technology that has been acquired, and we're going to incorporate that learning technology into our existing federation of technologies. How do we onboard that? How do we make that implementation work? It's not something that we're going to clear up on this call, but it is something that, especially for DoD customers who are working in zero trust environments, make sure that your procedures are in place early in the acquisition cycle to ensure that if federation is part of the implementation, that this can be addressed. Similar but different are the cases of certificates. So this gets to the question of, how do I know that an LRS is authentic, right? Should the LRP have some sort of certification, and who gets to certify that? Well, I think from the group, something that has come up is the idea that certification itself across the internet is often the matter of trust and relationships. And if there are authorities that are trusted authorities that are issuing certificates, that is why this certificate matters. So really, from a cybersecurity perspective, Although there are very granular issues related to certificates themselves, at the implementation and decision-making level, we should be thinking about, do we have trusted and authoritative providers of certificates to represent the trust that we're going to that we're going to expect, or that we're going to put onto the application of this LRP or LRS that we're now going to include in our ecosystem. An interesting thing here from the perspective of xAPI has to do then with profile servers. So at a high level, a profile server is a place to store profiles. And those profiles can be pinged by technologies to do a variety of things, including helping a system match patterns that occur within a learning experience. There are a variety of options that the authors of xAPI profiles have, including the implementation of linked data through JSON LD in the profiles themselves. In the case of very locked down systems, there are questions as to the viability of the linked data resources that could be made available to the profile. So there have to be decisions made at an implementation and a policy level around what to do with the creation of profiles, and whether you're going to fully leverage all of the attributes and assets capable to you through a profile, depending on your security posture. Those profile servers themselves can exist out on the open web. They could exist within enclaves in a DevSecOps environment. They could exist within private networks. But however you choose to implement or use profile server capabilities, I would recommend beginning by thinking about the advantages that you are trying to leverage from the attributes of the data design of the profile itself, and make sure that those attributes within that data design align with your risk profile. And that's sort of related to activity control, in that activities should probably contain the domain or evidence of the supplier of the activity, in order to have sort of a chain or a source of truth as to where the information came from. So for example, we may have an activity that is created by an instructional designer or an analyst within a shop within the DoD, and it's being applied to a specific application, a specific program. That's a different use case than where the shop decides to either contract out or use activities that have been created somewhere else in an external or third-party environment. So say that there is a library of activities available for some learning domain, say cybersecurity or training mechanics, and it exists out there, and as a an author of a profile or an author of a learning experience, I want to pull that in. One thing I want to do is, and it relates to sort of some of the authentication issues, is ensure that the material that I'm pulling in actually has some sort of evidence or chain of custody back to where it came from, who that third party is. So whether I'm using it wholesale or whether I'm adapting it, I have some level of control, or I can create a level of trust against my risk framework based on how I'm using that activity. In terms of lifecycle, one of the common ones that we get with xAPI has to do with making older systems with different security profiles communicate. For example, maybe one system has a lower statement size threshold than another. This can be an issue, and so you need in your implementation to consider how you're going to reject statements as a security modification. In working with these things within a standards-based environment, that can include saying, for example, we are not going to accept any data that is not conformant to this level of the specification or is not conformant to these established standard profiles. But know that having the authority and the ability to reject statements can actually become part of the implementation of a security protocol, making decisions as to what kinds of things meet the spec, but still you're not going to allow into your system. And that sort of closes out here with what we do in terms of auditing and response practices when situations do arise. And what the working group would recommend is common to what I think most groups within cybersecurity would recommend, is that for secure xAPI usage with regard to full stack security auditing and considerations related to incident response, that the implementation should include a third-party security auditing protocol, and B, implementation-based documentation for response practices. These could include, but aren't limited to, common vulnerabilities and exposures, compatibility, alarm response times, and documented responses to zero-day vulnerabilities. The move towards implementation of these technologies within established DevSecOps environments is certainly a good move with regard to ensuring parts of all of these things. But it remains that decisions have to be made as to exactly what those protocols are, what those response practices are. And that can be reflected within different ways within different types of organizations. So the next thing to think about in terms of xAPI cybersecurity practices has to do with risk management. So a risk management framework provides a means to assess several key areas of implementation relevant to secure operations. So the IEEE is recommending familiarity with and implementation or adaptation as appropriate of terminology and risk management framework processes over at NIST. National Institutes of Standards and Technology. And the way that they have sort of laid out the high-level stance towards risk management over at NIST is you prepare. In other words, essential activities are made to prepare the organization itself to manage the risk and manage the security, especially from a privacy standpoint. Second, you categorize. So you're going to categorize the system and information that is processed, stored, and transmitted based on an impact analysis. How is the information actually going to impact operations, and how does it impact your risk profile? Then you're going to select a set of controls. These controls come under the NIST 800 series, and these controls protect the system based on risk assessments. So we base the controls that we choose to implement on our assessment of what our risk actually is. So again, going to that very sort of highly abstract example from earlier in the presentation of, on the one hand, sort of a small scale experiment versus, on the other hand, a large scale enterprise federated system. You're going to have different risk assessments based on the different risk profiles, and you're going to set the controls as necessary to do what you need them to do. That will allow you then to implement the controls, document how they're deployed, assess and determine if the controls are in place, are they operating as they are intended to, and are they producing the desired results. One thing that you don't want in a risk management framework is to find that the controls that you have implemented are now confining your ability to carry out the mission. You have to strike a balance between the controls and the implementation, and you can do that by assessing outcomes and then iterating your selection of controls based on that assessment. Then you're going to authorize, where you make the risk-based decision to authorize the system itself, such as getting an ATO on a government system. And then you're going to monitor it through continuous monitoring. You're going to control the implementation and risks to the system. Our approach in this document is not to change any of that, but rather to say that this is an established system that has demonstrated that it works well, and we point people towards that as recommended guidance on how to handle risk management. I do have a bit more here. So I will talk about the three sort of big pieces here, where you have one, this categorization that occurs in part 2. So the categorization is the method for identifying the potential impact if a security breach occurred. So for example, just low, medium, or high. Low, the loss of the system would have limited adverse effect. High, it would have catastrophic impact. So that's what we're talking about when we're talking about categorization. In terms of those selection controls, number 3, the selection controls, really, you can think of them as being used to identify risk. So you can use the selection controls to identify the risks and establish methods of mitigation. In writing this draft document, we've begun doing that in the section prior in this conversation, where we have common risks or common issues, and then we have mitigations that this standard recommends taking against those risks. And you have to also consider the characteristics of the system in relation to the intrinsic risk based on the categorization itself. In implementing the controls, you're implementing the methods, tools, processes. So these are not all entirely like automated technical things. They include human processes necessarily to actively mitigate the identified risks. And then the controls rely on the methods and available tools to mitigate the risks. These can include anything from physical security measures, like surveillance in a physical location, to network management practices, like having access control lists, to having host-based security systems. So there are a variety of both physical and digital means to implement these controls that you've selected. For transport layer security itself within these controls, it's recommended for secure xAPI usage that the transport level security follow common best practices: strong signing algorithm, strong key exchange, and secure HTTPS on all communications. And these are meant to mitigate or to prevent message interception, man-in-the-middle attacks, and any alterations that can be attempted between the message and the statement in its transport between the learning record provider and the learning record store. With regard to PII, or personally identifiable information, it's understood that many implementations of xAPI are going to capture personally identifiable information. But such data capture is not unique to xAPI. Therefore, with regard to data privacy processes, as well as the governance, transparency, and machine readability of any privacy documentation, the recommended practice should be to follow guidelines of established developing standards that are germane to the matter of PII at large. In the IEEE context, we point you towards the IEEE 7000 series, which covers all aspects of data privacy. With regard to xAPI, the most important are the data privacy processes themselves, standards for student or learner data governance, recommended practices for virtual classroom security, standards for transparent employer data governance. So in cases where we may be merging training data outcomes into HR or readiness or mission planning capabilities. And then standards for machine readable personal privacy terms themselves. This is developing concept that privacy policies and terminology within privacy policies should be standardized and machine readable. In terms of xAPI data conformance itself, because an xAPI ecosystem relies on data validation, xAPI data conformance itself comes into the security stance. And the common way to think about this is that a learning record store has to be established as having passed the ADL test suite for LRSs. This ensures conformance. An LRP, or a learning record provider, will provide data that can be validated and accepted by an ADL conformant LRS. So we ensure the data conformance of learning record providers by their ability to pass that information into conformant learning record stores. And then for xAPI profiles, currently, many implementers are using the profile validation capabilities that are inherent to DataSim. Full transparency, my team worked on the development of DataSim. It is a open source Apache 2.0, completely free application. But what it does is DataSim uses xAPI profiles to generate synthetic xAPI data, and it will exclusively produce xAPI data based on the conformance of the profile to the profile specification and the conformance of xAPI statement templates within the profile to the profile itself. We see this sort of work over time developing into something that will be provided by profile servers. But those three pieces, the LRS itself, the LRP, and xAPI profiles can provide you with data conformance that enhances your security stance. xAPI and DevSecOps currently, ADL is undergoing a project to set up reference models of the total learning architecture within DevSecOps. That includes a variety of applications and systems. Again, full transparency, the open source Apache 2.0 SQL LRS is a project that my team works on. That is available in Repo 1's Iron Bank. There are other LRSs that are available, but I put it here as an example of an LRS that has gone through the DevSecOps process within DoD systems. And there are many more secure ADL resources available in Iron Bank and through Repo 1 and Platform 1 related to the entire TLA. So, some quick takeaways. Number one, xAPI fits into common security practices. It's not really something special, though there are some special things about it. Second, the communication between the learning record provider and the learning record store, that's what's really foundational. That is sort of the unique characteristic of xAPI, and that is something that implementers need to think about, both in terms of technical capability and implementation, as well as policy. The LRS conformance helps to ensure system integrity. When in doubt, use your LRSs wherever they come from to ensure that the data is valid against the standard. And secure implementations should leverage capabilities. You really want to be able to work with providers and implementers who can show off chops when it comes to DevSecOps. Capabilities there are really important in terms of ensuring the continuous integration of security best practices. To join the xAPI Security Working Group, you can contact me directly. Participation is free, and it's open to the public, and I welcome all of you there. Thank you for the opportunity to present today at this ADL webinar, and I hope to talk to many of you about the work at IEEE. Over and out.
This is Julie Lowndes, the Technical Webinar Coordinator and CETA Contractor for ADL Initiative. I'd like to thank Shelly for sharing his xAPI expertise with us today. Shelly is co-founder and CEO of Yet Analytics, a firm which has provided xAPI solutions to the U.S. Space Force, U.S. Air Force, U.S. Army, and the ADL Initiative, as well as to the industry. Shelly is an officer of the IEEE Learning Technology Standards Committee, where he chairs the working group on xAPI cybersecurity. Shelly has invited participants in today's webinar to bring your xAPI technical concerns to the working group, and you can contact Shelly with more information about the group, which is free, open to the public, at shelly@yetanalytics.com. Today's webinar has been recorded and will be available on adlnet.gov early next week. So thanks again to Shelly, and thank you for joining us today.